So I wanted to make a bit of an update on my Kyosho Inferno 10e. From the last time I ran it at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals, I noticed it was a good car, it ran well, but there were two main problems that I had with it at the time. The first was the jumping performance was a little bit lacking, and the second was I ran into some drivetrain problems, a series of drivetrain problems. So I'll start with the jumping performance. I think primarily the jumping performance was limited by the front bumper on the car. I mean, there could be other reasons too, suspension, whatever, but the front bumper does make a difference. And I mentioned this, I think, also on my Yokomo 93 Works, and one of the videos I did on that, where the bumper I was using had a leading edge that was well ahead of the front of the tires. In the case of the Kyosho Inferno 10, it's even more pronounced than it was on the Yokomo Works. That's a really big difference. And so if you're approaching a jump face, your approach angle is going to be much shallower with a bumper like this than with a bumper that's more inset, where the leading edge is behind the front of the tires. And so, if you have a track with like really sharp jumps, like on the particular layout that we had at the Vintage Nationals last year, there was a series of jumps in the back that had these really sharp jump faces. And with a bumper like this, the bumper is just bound to just scrape the approach to the jump, and that could cause the car to nosedive a bit, or it could compromise the jumping performance in some way, as the car is essentially dragging along the track in that part of the jump. So all I did, I just made a custom bumper out of Kydex. I traced out the shape of the original bumper and I just cut it more shallow, and I bent it more shallow so it folds up right up against the front bulkhead and the inner. It's a little bit hard to see here with the lighting. Let me see if I can just do this. And there you go. You can see where the hinge pins are and the hinge pin cross brace there, and it just barely folds up into the front of the shocks. Okay, it doesn't touch, but it's very close. So you would think, okay, well, with a bumper like this, there's not much impact protection, which is true, because if you hit something, you're not going to have much margin before the bumper, let's say, hits the shocks or hits the bulkhead. But really, if you think about it, the bumper on cars like this isn't really meant for impact protection. So if you look at, for instance, like a late model YZ10, like something like this, that bumper folds up right up against the very, very front of the suspension arms, right? And if the wheels were mounted here, the wheels would have be ahead of the leading edge of the bumper, right? And then on the Cat 2000, in this case the 2000 EC, same thing, right? You can see the wheels are ahead of the leading edge of the bumper, and that bumper is tiny. That's not going to protect you against much, if anything, really, except the inner hinge pins and maybe the front bulkhead, but that's not much. So I was kind of going for the same thing here. Push the bumper behind the front of the front wheels. Okay, so that's all I did with that. Just Kydex, trace it, cut it, put it, heat it up, bend it, no big deal. Now, the drivetrain is the big part here. There's a few things that happened. So one thing is related to the center differential. So I had locked the center differential on this because all the differentials as they came on the car were gear differentials, and they were not oil filled. They were not designed as oil filled diffs. So and those diffs spun rather freely. So that's not necessarily something you're looking for if you're going to run on like a modern hard packed dirt track with, let's say, a 10.5 brushless motor. You're just going to diff out everywhere in all the corners, in the middle of the corner, on corner exits. It's going to be a really difficult driving experience. So first thing to do is to lock the center diff. And the way I did that, essentially, this is just another version of that center diff, was to put little O-rings on the inside of these shafts here, between these shafts and the diff halves, to essentially push those bevel gears closer to the center of the body of the diff to cause everything to bind up and lock. And that did work for a while, but eventually those O-rings became so stressed that they snapped. even though I put grease on them. And then as they snapped, then that loosened up the diff, and then the diff could start spinning freely again. So then I no longer had a locked center diff. The other problem I had was with the front and rear diffs, where if I had modified those to be able to accept oil and not leak, or leak at a very low rate. But what ended up happening was it required me to use only 2 of the 4 screws that you screw the diff halves on, and it wasn't holding very tight. So especially the rear diff, when I used the brakes really hard, like on corner entry, it would stress that diff, and those 2 halves would start to separate. And then as you run it over time, then you start to hear some grinding noises, because that diff isn't perfectly sealed and it's not perfectly closed up, and so you have very loose meshing between all the gears, and the gears are starting to grind. So okay, I had to figure out something else. Luckily for the front and rear diffs, I may have gone over this in another video, Duratrax did make a ball differential hop-up for these kinds of cars. Because the Inferno 10 shares a gearbox with, I think, the RS200 and the ZR1. Kyosho had a bunch of cars that used these gearboxes. So Duratrax made ball diffs for those cars, which by extension also applies to the Inferno 10. So I was lucky enough to find 2 of those. So I have 2 ball diffs now, front and rear. So I don't have to worry about, setting up these weird gear diffs to accept oil and dealing with like leakage when the diff halves fall apart. So that part's all fixed. But now you have a locked center diff with ball diffs front and rear, and so the only slippage you can get is if you set up the ball diffs just loose enough so that the ball diffs themselves can act also as a kind of a slipper clutch. But then the diffs are slipping and you're not getting very much power transfer. So really, with those ball diffs in there, you got to find a way to modify the center diff so that it actually does diff. You get some differential action, but it's not super loose. So then you have to think about, okay, well, what can I do to this thing without filling it with oil and without using O-rings to essentially lock the diff to get it to be a little bit tighter than what it is in stock form. And all it really comes down to is shims. So, Kyosho makes a bag of a set of like 5mm inner diameter shims, and they come in like 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3 millimeter thickness. And that's all you need. You get that, I don't remember the part number, but you get that bag, and on the inside of either of these, you just shim it progressively more and more to get a little bit more bind. So essentially you're inducing bind to act like adding thick diff oil to a conventional gear diff that's sealed. And there is a window there where you can add a couple of shims and sort of increase the binding, if you will, between the internal gears, but not increase it so much that it actually pushes the diff halves apart and then you can't tighten the whole thing down. Okay, because again, you're pushing these shafts inward to the center of the body here, and that's going to push the 2 halves of the diff apart. So when you tighten it down, it won't actually tighten down. But there is a window in there of a few tenths of a millimeter. So you can go, I don't remember exactly how many shims I used. I think it was like around 0.5 or 0.6 millimeters on one side, and then another 0.3 or so on the other side. So maybe on the order of like, let's say 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter of total shims on the inside of the body here, give or take a bit. And that gives you enough resistance with the center diff. Seems to work. So I put that in there, and then I just put grease in the inside of the diff, and I mounted it, and it actually works. It actually works like a pretty decent center diff, as you would see on a modern, four-wheel drive buggy with a sealed gear diff. But this is not a sealed gear diff. It's an unsealed gear diff that's shimmed to intentionally induce a little bit of extra bind between the internal gears, and then I just put some grease in there, and then that's it. I tested that out on the driveway, and it does seem to work pretty well. Like, I don't get any slippage of the ball diffs. You can sort of kind of hear or see or could sort of sense, as you like mash the throttle from a cold, a dead stop, how the car kind of takes a little bit to get moving because it's, distributing power through the center diff, which is exactly what you would want on an actual track, like a high grip track, where you're really getting on the power really hard coming out of corners. So between what I did with the bumper, which is a pretty simple fix, and with the drivetrain, this is a much, much better car now than it was when I ran it at the Vintage Nationals last year. So now the question is, which car am I going to run next time? Do I run this because I feel like I've kind of worked out all the kinks with this car? Do I run my, Yokomo in the same four-wheel drive classes for the 10.5 motor four-wheel drive cars? Do I run something else? Right now I'm deciding between this Kyosho and this particular YZ10. It's a 95 YZ10 with a 97 upper deck. Both cars are really, really good. And I just got to figure out what to run, because I have a long list of cars, and you only live once, so I want to try to get through all the cars I have that I haven't run yet. But anyway, still working on making that decision for the next Vonats that I get to go to. But between what I've shown in the other Inferno 10e build series and what I showed you here with what you could theoretically do with the drivetrain, this should get you a pretty good Inferno 10e electric converted car. If you can't find those Duratrax ball diffs, by the way, another thing to do is just like what I did with the center diff. Okay, you could take the stock gear diffs and just shim them a little bit to induce a little bit of bind, put some grease in there, and you get some differential action. It's not super loose, it's not super tight, it's kind of in the middle, and that should be pretty good too. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching.